So, in order to unpack today's gospel, I want to tell you another story in the Bible. It's a story, though, that might not be familiar to you. And once I tell it to you, you might think, how could that possibly be in there? It's the story of Ananias and Sapphira. A few people are laughing. Don't get ahead of me. If you know it, don't stop me. You'll ruin the sermon. So, picture it. Jerusalem, the year 30-something. Jesus has died, Jesus has risen, Jesus has flown away. The disciples are left. The disciples are putting together the first days of the church. They're gathering themselves together, doing the first work of the church. And new members are joining. And one of the things that's happening in the early church is that everyone who joins the church is holding all of their property in common. No more private property. They hand everything that they own over to the church, to the common, to the collective of the church. Ananias and Sapphira were newcomers to the church. They had joined the early church, married couple. And since it was a requirement of being part of this community, they sold off their land. They sold off their land, the source of their wealth. They sold it off in order to give the proceeds to the church. But they held a little bit back, secretly. So Peter, knowing all things, let go with it. Peter, knowing all things, St. Peter, calls Ananias in to the principal's office and asks him, have you given everything from the sale of this land? And Ananias, what do you think he says? Yes. Yes, Peter, of course, we've given it all to you. And without missing a beat, right there, God, to use a biblical euphemism, smites Ananias. I told you, you're not going to believe that this is in the Bible. But it gets worse. Peter calls in Sapphira, grieving widow, and asks her, Sapphira, when you sold that land, did you give everything to the church? What do you think Sapphira says? Yes. What do you think happened to Sapphira?
She gets smited.
Smited to. End of story. Ooh. What are we to take away from this? Why am I telling you this story that is in the New Testament? Number one, here are 3 takeaways. Number one takeaway is, if you want to claim to be a biblical literalist, you also need to be a communist. You follow me?
Yep.
No more private property. You want to be part of this thing? No more private property. Okay. Number two, God, sometimes people say, God of the Old Testament, it's more the God of Jesus, the God in the New Testament. Not a thing. The God of Jesus is the God of the Old Testament. That God is waiting in the wings for moments like this to smite people, when that God really needs to. 3, the person who wrote this story about Ananias and Sapphira is the same person who wrote the Beatitudes that we just read today. Okay. So, because this is Luke. Luke writes Luke's gospel. Luke writes the Acts of the Apostles, where that story comes from. It's part 1 and part 2 of Luke's gospel. So, when Luke has Jesus say, remembers Jesus saying, "Blessed are the poor, and woe to the rich." We have to understand that in the context of what Luke thought the church should be and what he thought the early church was. It probably was never that, right? But that's the ideal. That is what he's saying. You have a choice. Will you be rich and cursed, or will you be poor and blessed? And if you are rich now, if you have anything now, your choice is to give it all away, give it to the church, and be poor among us. To hold it in common with the rest of us and have nothing on your own. Now, we Episcopalians do not like binaries. We do not like it's got to be this or that. We did a whole spiritual growth class about this a couple weeks ago, right? We like our gray areas. We like complexity. We like seeing things from multiple perspectives and the messiness of life, and you can't boil things down to simple choices of do this or do that, be poor or be rich. And if Luke were here right now today, I think he would say, yeah, I'm with you. I agree. That's what's going on in my whole gospel. I'm trying to deconstruct all these binaries, Jew and Gentile, and Jew and Samaritan, and woman and man. That's what I'm doing. And Episcopalians, sometimes you really have to make a choice. Sometimes you really have to decide it's got to be this or it's got to be that. You're either for this or you're for that. So I don't think Luke gives us any outs. He presents us with that stark choice. And you can't just give enough to charity to get out of it. You can't just kind of soften or spiritualize it. He is, I think, dead serious about this. So what the heck are we supposed to do with that? Well, one option, we could do it. I'm happy to announce next Sunday, we will have a team of lawyers here. You all bring all of your documents so that you can sign everything over to St. Gregory's. Are you in on this, honey? Okay. Yeah. Right? Because the first question you should always ask is, yeah, where is your paperwork, Pastor? Do we have all of your land? Right? Okay. So anybody coming for that? Anyone going to come and sign over all their stuff? Okay. Didn't think so. That's option one. Option two, we could ignore it. We could pretend it's not in our Bible. We could pretend this is not part of what the earliest followers of Jesus thought that Jesus was up to. We all have our own private Bibles where we cut out the things we wish weren't there, right? More laughter, yes, right? Me too. We could despair. We could say, well, what is the point? How can we possibly? And just kind of wallow in our own inability to actually live up to this. Or I think there is yet one more option. When presented with something that seems impossible for us to do, an ideal that we just cannot achieve, maybe just stretching toward it is all we can do. As a general rule, as a way of kind of engaging with the Bible at all, is when you get to those points where like, I don't know how we can possibly do this. This seems impossible. Rather than shrinking away from that, rather than softening it and saying, well, it must not mean that, rather, I think we can lean further in. Because that's where the actual spiritual growth happens, I think. It's like resistance training, right? You can't build up muscle unless there's something resisting what you're trying to do. We can't read the Bible and only pay attention to the parts that feel good and that we already agree with. It's the parts that challenge us, the parts that make us think, oh, God, how can we possibly? That's where we have an opportunity to step into something new and become stronger and become a different people from how God has found us. So, what do we do with this idea? What do we do with this idea that we should have all of our property in common, and that's really the only way of being blessed and following Jesus and receiving the blessings of God? Well, maybe, at the very least, it can help us rethink how we are in the world and think about the world that we inhabit in terms of a commons, in terms of what we actually already have in common, what we hold in common. Things like the neighborhood that is around us. Yeah, we've all got our own little pieces of property, including the church, and we've all got our own bank accounts, and we've all got our own jobs, etc., etc. And is there a way that the church becomes transformative for us and for our neighbors by turning everybody towards thinking about what we share in common and what we might share more in common? You might not know it, but I'm starting to give you a commercial for what we're doing after church today. We're going to do an exercise called neighborhood mapping, where we're actually going to think about where God is calling us to share things in common in the area right around where we sit. But that idea of a commons, the idea of a commonwealth, that idea that everybody does better when everybody is doing better, changing the narrative about what we have private property for. What is it doing? The idea of the common good. All of this kind of language, maybe this is what Luke is stretching us to re-inhabit, to reclaim, and to embody in our ministry. Because, friends, as I said before, when we do stretch towards that impossible, stretch towards what is impossible, that is how we grow into the full stature of Christ. Amen.